So, the meanings of America is the course. So yeah, what we're looking at here is the mythologies of America, the stories we tell ourselves, and the identities that result from those stories. So the identities that we've looked at so far are the native nation, the religious nation, the immigrant nation, and the destined nation. As you could probably guess, if you don't already know, these are mythologies. These are groups of stories. They are not simply separate stories. They are intimately related, as we'll see again tonight. I think you know this myth. I think you live this myth in various ways. The myth of the self-reliant American. We see it first kind of in outline in the famous Frenchman, another famous Frenchman, later than our old friend Crevecoeur, Alexis de Tocqueville, in his book Democracy in America. Remember, this is before, well, it's right around the Revolution, but it's the nascent nation just getting going. So he's kind of an anthropologist in a way, and this cultural anthropologist. And this is what he says about the America that he sees as he travels around. It is odd to watch with what fervish ardor Americans pursue prosperity, ever tormented by the shadowy suspicion that they might not have chosen the shortest route to get it. They cleave to the things of this world as if assured they will never die, and yet rush to snatch any that comes within their reach, as if they expected to stop living before relishing them. Death steps in the end, and stops them, as if that were the only thing, before they have grown tired of this futile pursuit of that complete felicity which always escapes them. That's us, right? I mean, that was 1700s. You may know self-reliance. We could have called it any number of things. In fact, this is very much related to the American dream, as we'll see. And in fact, as I've mentioned a few times, we could have chosen a lot of different identities and a lot of different stories. These are just my entry points into the mythology. Of course, Self-Reliance is a famous essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson, a unique interpreter of self-reliance in America. We also have the self-made man, Frederick Douglass, who we're going to come back to, and who I hear is doing great things. Expressive individualism, you may have heard that phrase. Basically an American romanticism. Rugged individualism, that was Herbert Hoover. That's kind of a good phrasing if you're going through the Depression, as was happening during Hoover's time. Rags to riches, you know that one, right? That's Horatio Alger. We're going to talk about him and his young adult novels in the 19th century. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You've heard that, right? Apparently that was a nonsense phrase that was meant to say it's something you can't possibly do, which is true. But it got, as myths do, they are protean, and it changed to something that you should do. Not only that you can do, but that you must do. You must, because obviously you can't, ergonomically, that's not going to work. But I guess in the American dream, you must do that. And then you may have heard, God helps those who help themselves. That actually comes from the Greek playwright Sophocles. Oh, sorry, I had this quote on the bootstraps I forgot about. The very language we use to describe the self-made ideal has these fault lines embedded within it. To pull yourself up by your bootstraps is to succeed by dint of your own efforts. That's a modern corruption of the phrase's original meaning. It used to describe a quixotic attempt to achieve an impossibility, not a feat of self-reliance. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. any more than you can by your shoelaces. Try it. The phrase's first known usage comes from a sarcastic 1834 account of a crackpot inventor's attempt to build a perpetual motion machine. Isn't that great? So next time you hear somebody tell you to pull someone should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, you can reference that. Okay. Self-reliance in culture, that's a more profound thing that gets at what we're doing here, which is myth and identity. It is, scholars say that this is an American invention, a unique cultural product of America that comes from de Tocqueville and Crevecoeur and some other people we're going to see as we go through the lecture. It evokes utopian visions of a classless society, except it's not, it's a middle classless society, right? So as we'll see, this is not always about getting rich. It's not really rags to riches, for example, in Alger. It's really rags to middle class, which is interesting in itself and informative. There's also a kind of social Darwinistic element to it where the assumption is we all start at the same place, and so we follow the same rules. And so if you didn't make it as far down the road as I did, well, that's on you. Yeah, well, your point, I don't know if you've been reading American cultural criticism, but you just beautifully evoked some criticism of the social Darwin idea in American culture. It's not fittest. It doesn't end up being fittest. Maybe it never was about that. It becomes about excess. Greed, exactly, which is not an evolutionary trait. You can't accumulate too much to eat. What's the evolutionary value in that? And so there's actually quite a few deep critiques of the very notion of social Darwinism, much less social Darwinism in America and how it is evoked. It is a lazy kind of mythology. You like that? Let's remember our old friend Roland Barthes, the French critic who was killed by a laundry truck walking on the streets of Paris. I say that because he would appreciate that. Who said in his little book Mythologies, he said, myth transforms history into nature. Myth takes what has happened and made it inevitable. Right? That's exactly what you two are talking about, right? So that's a brilliant move. That's myth's move, is to say, oh no, this is natural. This is Darwinistic. This is evolutionary. That's a really powerful mythological move and rhetorical move. And so, for example, you've got, I don't know a lot about this, but see, Charles Murray, that guy who's done some science on African Americans being intellectually inferior, that guy's still around, you know, saying this. And I guess it's because it sure works. This myth is really powerful, that we're all, you know, if we're surviving or thriving, it's because we're the fittest and the best. Of course, that fits beautifully with notions of aristocracy already. The powerful love myth, because it justifies their position. The non-powerful love myth, too, because it gives them an ideal for action. Marx was especially good at critiquing this, right? Sorry. Where, you know, he says, isn't it interesting that the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, give you nothing or little and take the product of your labor because they own the means of production. And you don't get much now, but they're going to promise you something in the end in heaven. Well, that's a good business deal, right? Marx would say. Sure, pay me now. I'll give you later what's your due. There are other critiques of the self-reliance myth. It is anti-Christian. I mean, Jesus did not preach self-reliance. he preached brokenness and the need for love and dependency upon kindness and grace. Because self-reliance is about not needing anybody or anything. And again, I'm kind of flying at 30,000 feet here because there, as we're going to see, there are many self-reliance myths, some of them contradictory. There are many Christian myths. So the version of Christianity I gave you was based on Jesus. There's another version of Christianity based on Paul, or a version of Christianity based on Calvin in particular, that's very different from that. Max Weber talked about, wrote about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So the people found ways to merge Christianity and capitalism, and still have. So I'm just giving you some big picture stuff before we delve into it. Happiness, the self-reliance story. Well, we're going to see. It was always about, it's kind of first about prosperity, you know? And only with Emerson and Thoreau does it become something internal and spiritual and reflective and contemplative. So it's kind of always been about prosperity. And, you know, does happiness equal prosperity? I don't know. Anybody prosperous here want to comment on that? There are contradictory qualities in the self-reliance myth. That's fine. That's what myth does. That's why myth isn't, that's why it's not logos. It's not rational. Because if it were rational, you'd have to deal with these contradictions. But myth is a way to overcome the contradictions. So it's about self-denial. The self-reliance myth is about self-denial. Well, we're going to see in the next slide with Benjamin Franklin. It's about delaying gratification. It's about being industrious. It's about being sober and measured in everything. And in exchange for that self-denial, you get self-reliance. It's a contradiction. That's what I'm saying. It's a contradiction. Don't shake your head at me. It's about self-realization and self-denial. Okay. And it's blatantly about self-interest. So there are these inherent structural contradictions here. I think this is the deepest critique, is that there's no communal element here. It's you alone in the world making your way. It's very attractive, it's very seductive, but it's also impossible, right? I mean, you can't make your way alone. So, this is where it starts. Benjamin Franklin. He's been called by scholars, I think it was some 19th century writer called him Homo Americanus. The American species, right? The American exemplar. He was called the model representative of the American dream. Those are his dates. And a liberal capitalist hero. So understand when we're talking about liberal in the 18th century, we're talking about democratic notions, democratic rights and freedoms, self-expression, self-determination, etc. Poor Richard's Almanac and then later his autobiography were among the best sellers of the century and are still pretty good sellers, I think. Do you remember this maybe from school, Poor Richard's Almanac? It's basically just like, you know, penny saved is a penny earned, that kind of stuff. It's about, and the autobiography is about how to rise, this is from the autobiography, how to rise from obscurity to some degree of reputation in the world. Right? I mean, we live out that myth a little bit, maybe. Not that we want national or international reputations, but we'd like to be known where we work, or maybe, I don't know. So Franklin, remember, is the exemplar. He's the one people point to as the ultimate self-reliant American. How do you do that? Through industry and frugality. Because it's not a very sexy, unlike social media, it's not a very sexy path. It's about saving your money. It's about working hard. It's about getting up early. You know, all that stuff that you find in Poor Richard's Almanac. So yeah, and again, this is uniquely American individualism and free will against what Franklin saw as a deterministic social order. Remember, the new America had just been born from Europe, and so Europe laced and laden with aristocracy and religion. And so you've got this new geographical space because you don't see the people who are there, but you've also got this new imaginative space, and that's where the self-reliant American comes in, is that we don't have a social order at this point. I mean, we do, but in the imaginative space, you're free to become whatever you want. Remember Crevecoeur and de Tocqueville, who were like, this is amazing, because they're Europeans, and they're like, oh my God, there's this land, and then there's this imaginative space in which to recreate yourself. Franklin does that uniquely, and then becomes a role model. There's it's supposed to be Protestant religiosity. There's a little Freudian slip. Protest plus a Calvinist work ethic equals a capitalism that offers individual and national wealth. That's the formula, right? I think we know that formula and try to live by it. As you know, a vague Protestantism, if need be, because you need a little religion to succeed. You've got to have that to be successful in America. I mean, would we ever have an atheist president? I don't know. Doubtful. But you've also got to work hard. And it's more than that. You've got to show that you're working hard, right? So you can't go home at night and work really hard in secret. It has to be a public presentation of your work ethic, right? That comes right out of the Puritans, right? Where we're watching and we want to see these good works. So Protestant ethics, spirit of capitalism, Max Weber. All right. So now we're at the point where we have a myth that has been promulgated through literature in the 19th century. And one of the most famous ones was Horatio Alger, 1832 to 1899, his Rags to Riches books. That one's called The Student and the Schoolmate. Student and Schoolmate. An illustrated monthly for all our boys and girls. Because if you want a mythology to take root, you give it to the children. They're more open to it. These, you've heard of this? Horatio Alger? No? Okay. Okay. The characters are always impoverished boys with single mothers who, through hard work and virtue, achieve wealth and respect, except that's not quite right. They achieve wealth compared to where they start. There's always a helper figure, as in The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. There's always a kind of mentor who comes along, who is himself, always him, wealthy or at least successful, and teaches the young boy how to get to where he is. Think the inversion of this in Wall Street with Gordon Gekko. These books were very welcome because they countered the bad boy books of Twain, for example, where Huck Finn is not a good boy, right? In fact, Huck Finn is the anti-hero because if you remember, he says in what I think is the central scene of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is where he's on the raft and he has to turn Jim in or not, Jim the slave he's escaped with, and he's like, all right, I'll go to hell. I'm not going to turn my friend in to the slave hunters. I'll go to hell. So Alger's the opposite of that. He's like, no, we want to keep you in this lane, and if you stay in this lane, then you will become successful, which means some wealth. This fell out of favor. There were actually some parodies of Alger, but it reemerged during the Cold War. So 50s, especially early 20th century and into the 50s, where things feel like they're getting out of hand again. And so we have this story of how to stay on the straight and narrow and what it'll get you. There's often some sort of magical outside assistance or just pure luck. Again, we like that in our films. Like I said, it's never really riches. It's middle class. It's achievement to the middle class. Heike Paul, in her book, Myths That Made America, says this. I like this. As part dream, part fantasy, and part prophecy, the foundational myth of the self-made man seems to be powerful enough to defy the overwhelming evidence of its own baselessness. In other words, this story doesn't really get acted out. Maybe in a few cases, but that's not the story. It's the ideal, it's the story that, it's the myth that functions in the sociological function to say, here's your place and here's your behaviors, if you want to be a part of this group. Now, when I think of the self-reliant myth, I always think of Emerson and I always think of transcendentalism. So Emerson and Thoreau especially, that's Margaret Fuller, by the way. Let's put her in there because she's a transcendentalist, but nobody really talks about her that much. So hi, Margaret. But yeah, it's Emerson who brands this. And again, 19th century. So the 19th century is a really interesting cauldron of mythologies competing for prominence. He's going to go the opposite way from Franklin. He's going to go, and by the way, Franklin, like I said, becomes the touchstone, and so everybody kind of refers back to Franklin, except Emerson and Thoreau, who say, you know, success is personal and spiritual rather than public and material, right? Success in systems, in institutions, produces alienation, not happiness, and is antithetical to true self-reliance. And of course, you know, Thoreau, most men lead lives of quiet desperation, right? So there's this undercurrent, really kind of a concurrent myth, especially in transcendentalism, where the idea is maybe you should go from riches to rags instead of rags to riches, because the riches are getting in your way. The success is a problem. It's not a solution. It's tripping you up. It's distracting you. You should turn inward. Think of one of Emerson's famous phrases in light of Franklin. Emerson said, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. That's directly opposite of Franklin, right? Because you want to be open. You want to be exploratory. Anybody know this little story by Herman Melville, Bartleby the Scrivener? Fantastic story. 1853, the subtitle is A Story from Wall Street. So Bartleby is a young man who's hired by a successful Wall Street lawyer who is also the narrator of the story, and he's a scrivener, he's a copyist. So remember, it's 1853, it's Wall Street, there are no copy machines, there are no copy anything. If you want to copy something, you need a scrivener. You need some guy, some poor schmuck, to come in and copy it over. So yeah, he refuses to participate in this capitalist society. He works on Wall Street, and he says no. Every time he's asked to do something, he said, I would prefer not to. I mean, every time. So you've got this high-powered lawyer, and he's got his employees, and he's got his clients, and he's hired this scrivener, and every time he hands in something, well, actually, he does his basic work, but when he's asked to do anything else, like, hey, could you come in here and talk about this and with your colleagues? He's like, I would prefer not to. Every single time. It's utter genius. I want to read to you because you just kind of need to hear it. So here's a little excerpt from the short story, long short story. Remember, this is his employer speaking, the lawyer. In this very attitude did I sit when I called to him, Bartleby, rapidly stating what it was I wanted him to do, namely, to examine a small paper with me. Imagine my surprise, nay, my consternation, when without moving from his privacy, Bartleby, in a singularly mild, firm voice, replied, I would prefer not to. I sat a while in perfect silence, rallying my stunned faculties. Immediately it occurred to me that my ears had deceived me, or Bartleby had entirely misunderstood my meaning, because you cannot not participate, right, in this capitalist story. But that's what Bartleby's doing. I repeated my request in the clearest tone I could assume, but in quite as clear a one came the previous reply, I would prefer not to. Now notice he doesn't say he won't. That's what's maddening. If he says he won't, then fine, you're fired. He's just stating what he prefers, which is not to. Prefer not to? Echoed I, rising in high excitement and crossing the room with a stride. What do you mean? Are you moonstruck? I guess that's how they talked back then. I want you to help me compare this sheet here. Take it. And I thrust it toward him. I would prefer not to, said he. I looked at him steadfastly. His face was leanly composed, his gray eye dimly calm. Not a wrinkle of agitation rippled him. Had there been the least uneasiness, anger, impatience, or impertinence in his manner, in other words, had there been anything ordinarily human about him, doubtless I should have violently dismissed him from the premises. But as it was, I should have as soon thought of turning my pale, plaster of Paris bust of Cicero out of doors. He's going to get rid of his bust of Cicero, as one does. I stood gazing at him a while as he went on with his own writing, and then reseated myself at my desk. This is very strange, thought I. What had one best do? But my business hurried me. I concluded to forget the matter for the present, reserving it for my future leisure. I'm not going to tell you the ending of this story, but it's worth a read. There is, with Crispin Glover. I would prefer not to. Genius. There's also William Dean Howells' The Rise of Silas Lapham. Again, these are literature-carrying mythological elements. It's the nouveau riche versus those with social capital. So Silas Lapham is someone, for today, we might think of as a Silicon Valley person who's come into this wealth from nowhere. In other words, not from his family, versus people with aristocratic backgrounds. He's a self-made millionaire. A certain ethical decision he makes leads to his loss of wealth, and so he has to go back to the old neighborhood where he finds happiness, right? So it's the inverted success story. He has lost his wealth, but he has gained himself. Fascinating, right? So I hope I don't give the impression that these myths are existing, unchallenged in American culture and history. They are not. There's a cauldron of myth. Remember, too, when we talked about the immigrant nation, that American culture in particular, all cultures, but American culture in particular, is about difference because of the nature of its history. Lots of people, some people were here, lots of other people came in. It is laced with difference. And so the myths are going to be dealing with this difference. The Great Gatsby, of course, right? Scholars have suggested that Fitzgerald's novel is portrays Jay Gatsby as America itself. How so? Well, remember, this is the 20s for Fitzgerald. And so the 20s were kind of the tail end of the golden age. It's the robber barons. It's the jazz age and the resistance that jazz provides to the dominant culture. So this is a critique. The Great Gatsby, while we may see it as a celebration of American wealth and maybe even self-reliance, it's really not. Because Gatsby gets his wealth, why? For a woman, right? To impress a woman. As Emerson wrote, do not seek yourself outside yourself, right? Nice. Gatsby does that. Remember, he begins as James Gatz. Where is it? Illinois or Iowa, somewhere. He's a nobody. And he kind of embodies both the spectrum of the self-reliant myth, in that he begins as kind of Benjamin Franklin. He's industrious, he's frugal, and he saves, and he betters himself through the channels that are appropriate to him. But then, the schedule in general resolves is a phrase Franklin uses. You schedule your life and you make resolutions. He does all that, but then it doesn't work. In fact, it ends tragically. Here's a passage from The Great Gatsby. James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name. He changes his name. He had changed it at the age of 17 and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career. I supposed he'd had the name ready for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. Remember how far we've come. For Jefferson and Crevecoeur, the farmer was the model. Now, farmers are like, in 1920, you're a farmer? His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. Genius. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent. And to his conception, he was faithful to the end. All right. The salesman, right? What a great image for America, the salesman. I don't think you have that in the UK, do you? You don't have salesman as part of your mythology, right? Right, or on the continent. In America, we have salesmen. We know our friend Willie Loman from The Death of the Salesman, Arthur Miller's play. We know it from Glenn Ross, the most brutal depiction of sales probably in the history of American film. Put that coffee down. Coffee is for closers. The salesman, interestingly, the research suggests that the salesman fills the gaps left by the church and the aristocracy. So you don't have the authority of the church anymore. You have many churches dispersed. You don't have the authority of the aristocracy who own the land. Everybody kind of owns the land individually. So the salesman emerges as this kind of power broker within the mythology, or within the system of capitalism. The salesmen, remember early on, were traveling. They were always traveling salesmen. And part of the genius of George Whitefield in the Second Great Awakening was that he took that model and he became a traveling minister. Right? So you go around. America's a big place. You don't stay in one place. You keep moving around. Class boundaries are more fluid, so at least you can see the possibility, especially compared to Europe, you can see the possibility of your self-reliance and your industry and your frugality being rewarded by moving up. And in fact, who hasn't lived with that myth that you want to move up, right? Many of you got education, got degrees so that you could move up. A lot of the students I've taught, adult students I've taught over the years, need the credential, right, to move up. That's the new thing, but before that there were salesmen. It's an obvious path to a certain kind of self-reliance. Here's an interesting quotation from Walter A. Friedman, an interesting book called Birth of a Salesman. Great title, right? Salesmanship flourished in America for cultural reasons. In a country that from the outset held democratic elections and had no established church or hereditary aristocracy, salesmanship provided political and religious groups with a way to compete against their rivals for followers. And in fact, we see that now, with, especially in the last 20 years, the birth of the megachurch, which is tailored like an apartment complex or anything else, like a college, to satisfy your desires, to tell you what your desires are and to satisfy them, sorry. Moreover, with more fluid class boundaries, as I said, than in European countries, the skills of salesmanship, especially beginning in the late 19th century, offered a pathway to personal success. By the early 20th century, Americans read how to sell books and turned Bruce Barton's The Man Nobody Knows, 1925, which portrayed Jesus Christ as a successful sales and advertising executive, into a bestseller. See, I love that. I love how myth works. I mean, it's boring sometimes, but it's just really interesting that you have a dominant image of the salesman, so you make Jesus Christ a salesman. Right? Myth transforms history into nature. Myth is also stolen language. Sorry, I got to stop interrupting my quotes. Books on salesmanship skills still sell well today. This must have been written before the last election. Art of the Deal. Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, published 1937, remains one of the most popular of these books and draws in parts on lessons the author learned working as a salesman. All right, wrapping up. We do have immigrant success stories, and Heike Paul in her book categorizes them in 4 ways, and she uses a lot of different literature that I wasn't familiar with, so I'm just going to read her account of immigrant success stories. So, here's the thing. If you have a myth, it's hard. You can keep people from going to school with each other, but it's hard to keep them from believing a myth and acting on a myth. So she says there's the happy ending for the immigrant story, which is basically just where the immigrant comes in and fulfills the myth. There's the upward mobility with great loss. So the immigrant may follow the path but lose something important in the process. There's the other side of success. The immigrant may achieve some modicum of success, but the losses are greater than the gains. And then, my favorite, they're just other self-reliant stories that don't follow this pattern. Let me read you what she says, because she can explain it better than I. The 4 different success patterns that we can detect in representations of the immigrant experience cover a broad spectrum of responses to the myth of the self-made man. Affirmative ones that tend to mimic older rags to riches narratives, all right. Mildly affirmative ones that often substitute material gain with non-material notions of success, all right. Highly critical ones that mostly focus on failure rather than success, and mildly critical ones that sidestep the legal framework of the success myth but champion material success nonetheless. In all of these versions, the self-made man appears as more or less contested prototype of American entrepreneurship. Again, the self-reliance is really an economic myth, whereas social stratification and systemic inequality are more systematically addressed only selectively by writers and critics who are invested in a socialist agenda that often does not stop at national borders, etc. African American narratives. Interesting. Yes? Who? The quote? Heike, H-E-I-K-E. Paul, and her book is called Myths That Made America. It's free on Google Play. Yeah. Interestingly, if you have a myth out there, you can't control it. And so people can appropriate it at will, including people that the myth was designed to exclude, or either implicitly or explicitly. So we do have African American self-reliant myths, slave narratives. This really appears in slave narratives. Frederick Douglass, who again is doing great things, his little book called Trials and Triumphs. Here's what he said. I have sometimes been credited with having been the architect of my own fortune, and I have pretty generally received the title of self-made man. And while I cannot altogether disclaim this title, when I look back over the facts of my life and consider the helpful influences exerted upon me by friends more fortunately born and educated than myself, I'm compelled to give them at least equal measure of credit with myself for the success which has attended me, my labors in life. Isn't that interesting? Now, here's a man who is a slave and has possibly more right to the self-reliant myth than anyone, because he began not at the same place as everybody else, but in the whole. And yet he says it wasn't just me. I needed lots of help. And this is not him being diffident, shy, or deferring. He pulls upon Benjamin Franklin throughout this text. He's all about Benjamin Franklin as, you know, the original self-reliant man. But he's going to turn it and say it's more communal. Interesting. Booker T. Washington does the same thing in his book, Up from Slavery. Up from slavery? Yes, but I needed a lot of help. Interesting. And then, of course, President Obama. You may remember this speech. I hear all this, you know, well, this is class warfare, this is whatever. No, there is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you, but I want to be clear. You moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers, the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory and hire someone to protect against this because of the work the rest of us did. Now look, you built a factory and it turned into something terrific. Great idea. God bless. Keep a big hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes along. Maybe that's not so surprising, you know, because it's kind of obvious, right? Is that, especially maybe if you've come up from slavery or if you've grown up a minority in this country, you know that you need help. There's no real opportunity to make it on your own when the forces are arrayed against you like that. Now, this is the self-made woman. All right. I want you all to think about the self-made woman and help us understand it. It's really about a self-made outward appearance in the mythology, right? So is there a successful woman who's not beautiful according to society standards? Maybe, but not as likely. There's a scholar named Ann Douglas who calls this sentimental culture, the Victorian era in America, where she says this. I really think this is interesting. Sentimental culture. Women were both the stewards and the prisoners of sentimental culture. Theoretically reduced affect and relegated to the domestic space, women oversaw the cultural role of their own social and ontological captivity. Sorry, it's a little dense. Which provided the moral rationale for an increasingly economically competitive society. It's about domesticity, right? And that being the sphere of influence for women, but also a market, right? A market to sell to. Right, and Douglas calls, actually the book is called Consuming Angels, right? So you're an angel, you're in your domestic sphere, stay there, take care of your husband, take care of your family, but do I have a product for you? You know this, right? I mean, I'm not a woman, but I recognize this, right, in the marketing. Also, self-making for women in America has often been dependent, well, I think always been dependent upon men. In other words, you can't separate yourself from male roles as you get to self-reliance, so it's not really self-reliance. And of course, marriage sanctions your self-making. If you're of a certain age and unmarried, you may feel this pressure, right, to enter that institution for some kind of approval of your being. And of course, the way to, like the most obvious example of this is Miss America pageant, where beauty is the currency of self-making, right? And so we celebrate that as an American ritual for women, right? Which is not really for women, it's really for men, I think. My point is this: for women, myth is written upon the body, not for men. Myth writes itself upon women's bodies. This is not my idea. It's been stated in different ways by many feminists. But for example, think of Judith Lorber, who talks about how culture shapes women's bodies. I don't know if this is true anymore, but a few decades ago, women were taught to hold their legs together, to not climb trees, to not play sports, or to play sports in a certain way. And she says, I think she's pretty convincing in this, that it shapes your body. It shapes the way you hold yourself, shapes the way you sit on the subway, it shapes the way you move through the world. But there are deeper and more profound examples. Myth is written upon women's bodies in terms of beauty and the beauty myth, and how you must present yourself in a certain way to the world, because the world is dominated by men, less in population, more in terms of power. Culture is written, myth is written upon the bodies of women in terms of issues of reproduction and choice. I don't think that's true for men. I don't feel like culture writes on my body. I can be overweight. I can be lazy. My body is kind of irrelevant to my self-making. I don't think that's true for women, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. So, the self-reliant nation, related to and based on the chosen nation, right? Primarily economic. Maybe that's not a big deal for you, but I still have trouble because I always think of Emerson, but it's actually, in most instances, economic. But there are deep critiques to this myth, as there are to the others, that are both spiritual and social in nature. Emerson, certain forms of Christianity. The self-reliant American is uniquely white and male. At the same time, the self-reliant myth is open to immigrants and other ethnicities, because you can't contain a mythology. It does what it wants. People enact the story when and how they want. And then there's a unique self-reliance myth for women. That's what I think. What do you think?